In Ukraine, a fire broke out at the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant amid military actions in that Eastern European country. In Peru, the trial begins against 3 former health ministers for the forced sterilization of more than 200,000 indigenous women during the administration of former President Alberto Fujimori. In Syria, United States occupation forces are helping relatives of terrorists to leave the country. Hi, this is From the South. I'm your news anchor, Dio Martin, from the teleSUR studios in Havana. We begin with the news. In Ukraine, a fire broke out at the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant amid military actions in that Eastern European country. Reports indicated that the flames have only been reported in the administrative building. Station spokesman Andrei Tuiz said that the background radiation of the plant has not changed and detailed that there was no threat of radiation spread. The power plant is located in central Ukraine in Enerhodar, near the city of Zaporizhia, on the banks of the Kakova Reservoir on the Dnieper River. In this regard, experts said that the nuclear plant's power unit is a super-protected facility designed for a direct bomb hit and programmed to automatically shut down the nuclear reactor in case of any danger. A second round of ceasefire negotiations concluded in Belarus. Moscow and Kiev reached an understanding on the need to ensure humanitarian corridors for the evacuation of civilians. Kiev and Moscow also agreed to continue negotiations as they plan to hold the third round of talks as soon as possible. Vladimir Medinsky, head of the Russian delegation, said the agreements reached during the negotiations represent significant breakthroughs. Also, Russia and Ukraine called a temporary ceasefire during the evacuations. This aims to comply with a clause featured in the communique on the issue, which states that in the nearby future both parts will maintain special channels of communication and interaction open with the purpose of securing proper logistic and humanitarian aid. Russian chief of negotiations with Ukraine, Vladimir Medinsky, reported on the results of the second round of negotiations.
Negotiations with the Ukrainian side have just ended, where we discussed in detail 3 issues: the military issue, the international humanitarian issue, and thirdly, the issue of the political future and settlement of the conflict. We review point by point. In some of them we are able to find a mutual understanding, but the main issue is that what's decided today in this question of military confrontation zones. Accordingly, the representatives of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation and the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine agree on the format of locating humanitarian corridors for the exit of the civilian population and temporary cessation of hostilities in the sectors of the humanitarian corridor for the period of evacuations.
French soldiers landed in Romania to bolster NATO's eastern flank. More than 500 French soldiers arrived to a Romanian base near the Black Sea. Before that, the United States sent additional troops to the same country 3 weeks ago as part of NATO's rapid response deployment. The efforts to strengthen the eastern flank of the alliance amid the ongoing Russian special military operation in Ukraine and improve NATO's defense system in Eastern Europe. This is the first time that NATO has deployed its response force in the framework of collective defense, which comes after the Allies decided to activate the organization's defense plans. The World Health Organization sent a shipment of life-saving medical supplies to Ukraine. The World Health Organization said a shipment of life-saving medical supplies has arrived in Warsaw for delivery to Ukraine. The WHO's emergency medical team's network leader, W.H.O, said 36 tons of supplies arrived. World Health Organization concluded that the shipment includes trauma supplies to meet the needs of 1,000 patients requiring surgical care and other medical supplies to meet the needs of some 150,000 people. WHO officials noted that health facilities and health workers in Ukraine are in dire need of supplies to continue treating casualties, as well as people who are ill from other conditions. They strongly called for a safe passage for these and other humanitarian and health deliveries. On Thursday, the United Nations made a statement in reaction to reports of racism and xenophobia suffered by Ukrainian refugees. Briefing reporters in New York, the United Nations spokesperson Stefan Dujarric said the Secretary General is shocked by the several reports of racism, harassment, and discrimination that people of different races have been subject to as they try to leave Ukraine, as well as in neighboring countries as they seek refuge from the conflict. Also, he told that the Secretary General appreciates the generosity of the governments bordering Ukraine towards refugees and their attention to them, and called authorities in the region to crack down on any manifestations of racism and xenophobia.
People of different races have been subjected to as they try to leave Ukraine as well.
More than a dozen of United States senators introduced a bill with the object to ban energy imports from Russia, while the House of Representatives will introduce a complementary legislation. U.S. government will impose sanctions to a total blockade of 22 Russian entities and all related with the defense sector in response to special military operation that follows on in Moscow and Ukraine. For the first time, these sectoral sanctions include the partial designation of Russia in the SWIFT system and international reserves paralyzation of the issuing bank. We're going to take a short break now. Please join us again after this. Welcome back to From the South. In Peru, trial begins against 3 former health ministers for the forced sterilization of more than 200,000 indigenous women during the administration of former President Alberto Fujimori. It is expected that Eduardo Young Mota, Marino Costa Bauer, and the current congressman of the party Fuerza Popular, Alejandro Aguinaga, will be prosecuted for the practice of medical procedures without the consent of the victims. According to local media, they will be investigated for crimes of death, crimes against life, health, and serious injuries, in addition to human rights violations. Indigenous organizations announced that the accused were promoting forced sterilizations as a systematic practice to reduce the birth rate in rural areas. And the United States government authorized the Canadian company Revolut Group to send remittances through Cuba through its website, an action that could alleviate the unjust measure approved by former President Donald Trump to suspend remittances, although it increases the transaction cost for the Cuban family. Our correspondent Lisandra Andres brings us more information on the repercussions of the Caribbean island.
On Thursday, a Canadian company was authorized to send remittances to Cuba, although at a much higher cost for the Cubans who transfer money for the United States to their relatives on the island.
What they told me was to convert it to euros, and that in a practical sense, to get $100, you will have to be put $170 on that side to get 100 here. That is what they say. I don't know if it's real or not. I think it's excessive. I would like to see what reason they give for this 30% increase. To whom would this rate increase go? Because I don't think it would benefit the family's members. It is always the right thing to do, because even though there are differences between the two countries, it is a right for the people and the relatives we have there to be able to help the family here.
Maintain the blockade, we cannot develop economically, and if we cannot develop economically, we need someone to help us in some economic way. Yet, if they remove the blockade, we wouldn't need any remittances. Not for me in particular, but for people who have family members abroad. Sending remittances is an alternative to improve their economic situation. The company Revolut Group announced on March the 3rd that the remittances will be deposited in the accounts of Cuban citizens in the freely convertible currency accounts of the Bandec, BP8, and Metropolitan Cuban banks.
What was this time of suffering worth for? Nothing, because what they want to achieve they couldn't do it, and those who suffer as always were the Cuban families.
However, experts say, although the measure is a relief, the prohibition adopted by the Donald Trump administration for regular sending of remittances to the island persists.
A Canadian remittance company has been allowed. In this environment of absolute siege, of 243 measures stay in force to send remittances to Cuba in a much more expensive way than they were before, without clearly changing the rules of the game. I would say, making a soft analogy, that is like having someone on the floor with a boot of his neck, asking him to breathe, and then allowing another person to come and give him a small hose with oxygen, also step on with the same boot, and charging him a very high price for that oxygen.
In October 2020, the Donald Trump administration terminated Western Union's relationship with Cuban financial institutions in charge of the processing of remittances, which caused Cuban families to have to resort to irregular ways to send their money during the COVID-19 pandemic and made this process up to 6 times more expensive.
What the government of the United States, which right now has an extremist discourse on human rights, of the defense of peace and freedoms, should do is to be consistent and threat Cubans, not the government, but Cuban families, to be consistent with that rhetoric and treat them as human beings, and not as people who should be harassed, persecuted, and to whom a right is converted to a crime.
Although during his presidential campaign Joe Biden promised to reestablish the sending of remittances to Cuba, he has maintained this prohibition since his arrival at the White House. The unjust measure and the economic damage to Cubans on both shores remains in force.
Lisandra Andrés, Telesur, La Habana, Cuba.
Heads of state and government of the Caribbean community and the Central American integration system met for the 4th CARICOM SICA summit in San Pedro Belize. Member countries aimed at strengthening relations in the face of multidimensional challenges. The summit is expected to adopt the joint declaration of San Pedro with commitments to strengthen foreign policy consultation, actively collaborate on socio-economic development matters, including tourism, trade and investment, and strengthen cooperation in climate change and public health, among other matters. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres joined via video conference as a special guest at the summit and is expected to engage the heads on several matters, including COVID-19 pandemic response and recovery, climate change, financing for development, and the situation in Haiti.
Presidency, Mr. Alberto Fernandez, that is here with us today. Presenta nuestro presidente de Panamá.
In recent interviews, Belize's Prime Minister John Briceño has said that the government and the 3 public sector workers' union must have a serious conversation about pension reform. Public Service Union President Dean Flowers told local media Creme News that there has to be a reform not only in relation to pension, but in relation to proper wages.
How some individuals think in terms of how we are able to achieve the change that we so desire, but that's the selfishness that that in reality exists within some of our public officers who don't want to be a part of the union but expect the union to do so much for them. But in any event, we continue to be a union that fight for equity and for all public offices.
We have more news coming up after a final short break. Please stay with us. Welcome back. In Syria, United States occupation forces are helping relatives of terrorists to leave the country. According to the Syrian press, hundreds of relatives of the terrorists are being taken to Iraq by American soldiers. Those refugees have been boarded in some 200 buses and trucks departing from the Khan al-Jabal camp in the Syrian municipality of Qamishli. On several occasions, the Syrian government has announced that the White House and its allies support Daesh terrorists. This action by the United States occurs in the midst of the process of national reconciliation promoted by the Syrian government. The Burkina 2050 Consortium, a civil society group, demonstrated in the capital against a railway concession given to the French Bolloré Group. Activists marched from the Bataille du Haile roundabout to the Ministry of Transport via the Bolloré logistics site. There were also other protests in locations across the country, such as Citarail or government offices in Bobo-Dioulasso and other major urban areas. There have been increased hostilities toward the long-term presence of the French military across the Sahel region, including in Burkina Faso in recent months. French businesses' interests may also meet a corresponding uptick in local scrutiny in the weeks and months ahead. Sri Lanka's already dire economic crisis has deepened as oil prices hover near $110 a barrel. The country is now having to scrape into dwindling reserves to pay for oil needed to keep the economy running. With dollar reserves running short, banks are unwilling to open lines of credit for important events or essentials like milk powder, medicine, and fuel. Authorities have announced countrywide power cuts extending up to 7.5 hours a day because they can't supply enough fuel to power stations. Energy Minister Udaya Gamampila said stations are rationing fuel to stop people from stockpiling diesel at home for their vehicles and power generators. A $1 billion line of credit expected from India may ease things somewhat, but the fighting in Ukraine threatens to hit another important source of foreign exchange, tourists from both Ukraine and Russia.
Up to around 7.5 hours.
Thursday, a second wave of migrants tried a new mass break-in at Melilla enclave in Spain. Around 1,200 people tried to storm the border separating Spain's Melilla enclave from Morocco, with 380 getting across. The incident occurred a day after an unprecedented 2,500 migrants made a mass run at the border, and almost 500 managed to cross in what the Spanish government's local delegation said was the biggest entry attempt on record, to quote. Officials said both incidents were characterized by an unusual level of violence and quickly moved to call in security reinforcements to deploy along the border. 20 officers sustained cuts and bruises or other light injuries. And in France, President Emmanuel Macron officially announced that he's going to participate on re-election in the next April 10th elections. Through a public letter, French President asked confidence to the citizens, and he stated that he is postulating himself to elaborate a singular French and European answer to the challenges of this century. With this fact, Macron will formally opt into second consecutive period. The first round of presidential elections of France is scheduled for April 10th, and the second, if necessary, for the 24th of the same month. Now, French Prime Minister Jean Castex announced the end of compulsory mask wearing except on public transport for March 14th, which will also bring about a suspension of the vaccination pass. France will maintain a health pass for those working in and around hospitals, medical establishments, and retirement homes.
Situation is improving thanks to our collective efforts, thanks to the measures we have taken. So, yes, we will indeed. The conditions are met for a new phase of easy measures. So I am announcing to you that from Monday 14 March we are going to suspend the application of the vaccination pass wherever it applies. Second measure on the same date. We want something simple. The end of the compulsory wearing of masks in all places where it is still applicable. That is to say indoors, except I specified well for you. There are two measures that continue to remain in force. The wearing of masks will remain compulsory on collective public transport. And the second measure that remains in force, the health pass. If this concerns health establishments, all people's homes, establishments for people with disabilities who are particularly fragile, there, and the health pass remains in force, as does the vaccination obligation that applies to carers.
We've come to the end of this news brief, but remember you can find these and many other stories on our website at @teleSUR English. You can also join us on social media for all the latest news. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Telegram. For @teleSUR English, I'm Dio Martin. Thanks for watching.